what we don't want to do when we're teaching our students listening. We don't want to introduce the topic of the listening, give them a few vocabulary words to listen for, play the listening audio, and then have students answer some comprehension questions. This is not effective teaching. What we want to do is to fully exploit the language learning potential of the listening text. And we want to be strategic about how we do this. In this session, I'm going to give you 3 lesson patterns or arrangements of activities to use so that you can fully and strategically exploit the language learning potential of the listening text that you choose. The first lesson pattern exploits the listening text for meaning and form. The second lesson pattern exploits the listening text for meaning, and the third lesson pattern exploits the listening text for form. Once you have all 3 of these lesson patterns in your repertoire, you'll be able to teach listening in a really highly effective way. We'll start by discussing what it means to fully exploit a listening text for language learning purposes. Then we'll take a look at the 3 patterns. First, the hourglass lesson pattern, which exploits a text for meaning and form. Second, the meaning lesson pattern, which exploits a text for meaning. And finally, the form lesson pattern, which exploits the text for form. Let's get started. When we're exploiting a listening text for content, we're focusing the students on the meaning of the text or the topic. So we're going to ask students things like, what is the situation? Who are the characters? What are the characters saying? What are the main ideas? What's the purpose of this text? And so on. So we're working through our students through a lot of different meaning questions. When we're exploiting a listening text for form or language, we're taking our students through any of the following. We can take a look at the pronunciation, we can take a look at the vocabulary, or the grammar in the listening text, or finally the discourse of the listening text. So looking at a text or exploiting a text for form means analyzing the language at any one of these 4 levels. The first lesson pattern that helps us to fully exploit the language learning potential of a listening text is called the hourglass lesson pattern. The hourglass lesson pattern takes students through both the meaning and the form of the listening text. This lesson pattern is called the hourglass lesson pattern for a very obvious reason. The lesson pattern actually looks like an hourglass, which, if you recall, starts wide, goes narrow, and then goes wide again. And in a real hourglass, the sand pours down that little bottleneck in the middle. So our lesson pattern follows this exactly. We're starting very general, we're getting very detailed, and then we're going out to more general. Another way to look at the hourglass lesson pattern is to think of it as starting with meaning. So we start with meaning questions, then we go into form questions, and then we go back out to meaning questions. And the other interesting thing about the hourglass lesson pattern is the top half of the hourglass is all the receptive skills. So we are listening to the text at that top part of the hourglass lesson pattern. The bottom half of the hourglass lesson pattern, we work on the productive skills. So we get our students either speaking or writing. Let me take you through the steps of the hourglass lesson pattern so you can see these changes from meaning to form and back to meaning, and also the changes from receptive skills to productive skills. So I'll walk you through this pattern step by step. The first step of the hourglass lesson pattern is the warm-up. The purpose of this step is to introduce the topic of the listening text, set the scene, and get students engaged and motivated to listen to the text. The second step of the lesson pattern is to have students listen to the text for the main idea or the general situation. So students may establish what the situation is, who the characters are, the relationships among the characters, the emotional tone of the text, or the main argument of the text. So this step is focusing on meaning. The third step of this lesson pattern has students listen for detail. So they're trying to extract specific content details to deepen their understanding of the topic or of the situation. This step, once again, focuses on meaning. The fourth step of the lesson pattern has students listen for language. So you are directing them to listen to pronunciation, listen for specific vocabulary words, listen for particular grammatical structures, or listen for the discourse structure. So this step focuses students on the form. The fifth step of the lesson pattern has students actually analyze some piece of the language. So they're looking for rules, patterns, format, or word meaning, and usually they're either doing this in pairs or small groups, or you're doing it as a class. This activity once again focuses on form, but now we've switched to productive skills. Students aren't listening anymore, they're either speaking or writing. The sixth step in the Hourglass lesson pattern is controlled practice. So the purpose of this step is to give students the opportunity to use the language they've learned in the listening text in a controlled manner. So you're trying to get students to be accurate with their use of the language structure that they've learned. So once again, this is focusing on form, and this is a productive step. The final step in the Hourglass lesson pattern is free practice. The purpose of this step is to give students the opportunity to use the language they've learned in a real situation, and you're trying to get them to use it fluently. So fluency is the target here, and we're looking at meaning this time, not form. So the focus at this step is on meaning, and it's a productive step. These are the steps of the Hourglass lesson pattern. Regardless of the age of the students, the level of the students, or the topic or type of listening text, you're going to follow these steps exactly in order to exploit your listening text for both meaning and form. Next, I'll walk you through an example lesson pattern that uses a real listening text so that you can see this pattern in action. This sample lesson is for a high beginner group of students. The objectives of the lesson are: students will be able to listen for and produce descriptions of habits using simple present and adverbs of frequency. For the warm-up, elicit from the class topics that they might talk about with their friends when they're making small talk. If necessary, review the concept of small talk. Then indicate that one of the topics that we commonly use with small talk in English is our habits, or the things that we do on a regular basis. For the next step, have students listen for the general situation or the main idea. So tell students that they'll listen to a conversation between two friends, and they have to answer this question as they're listening. Are the two friends talking about last weekend, next weekend, or every weekend? Play part of the tape until this question is answered, and then check that students have the correct answers. You can do this as a class or in pairs. The next step has students listen for detail. So they're going to listen to the dialogue again and ask specifically for the activities that the speaker, who we'll call Bob, does. Then confirm their answers in pairs and then as a class. Finally, list the activities that Bob does on the right-hand side of your whiteboard or your blackboard. The next step has students listen for language. So students are going to listen to the dialogue again, and they're going to write down the adverbs of frequency that go with each activity that they listed in the previous step, and then confirm their answers in pairs and as a class. Finally, write the adverbs of frequency on the board next to the correct activity. So by this time, you've made a list on the board of adverbs of frequency and then the activities that go with those adverbs of frequency. In the next step, you're going to have students analyze the language. So students create full sentences from the prompts that you've put on the board. So these are your adverbs of frequency and then the activities. As the teacher, write down the answers that the students provide. With your full sentences, underline the verbs that students have given and circle the adverbs. Then elicit from the class how the present simple is structured in these sentences when using them to talk about habits. And make sure students know that that S goes on the third person of the present simple singular. For the next step, students are going to complete a controlled practice activity. They're going to work individually to write 4 or 5 sentences about their own habits following the same sentence pattern that you've now got on the board. So we're focusing on form, and it's productive, the same as the previous step. Finally, for the free practice, put students in pairs. Designate one person in the pair as a particular celebrity, and the students can choose who that is, and the other person in the pair as a TV interviewer. Have them role play an interview to find out what the celebrity's habits are on the weekends. So that was an example of the hourglass lesson pattern. As a quick review, this pattern allows us to exploit both the meaning and the form of a listening text. Students listen to the text 3 times. The first time they listen for general idea, the second time they listen for detail, and the third time they listen for language. We then flip into the productive skills, and students produce first the form of the language and then the meaning. The second lesson pattern that we're going to look at focuses exclusively on meaning. So we're having students listen to this text for the topic, the content, or the ideas. I'll start by walking you through the steps of this lesson pattern, and then, as I did with the previous pattern, I'll give you an actual example. The first step in the meaning lesson pattern is a warm-up. So once again, the purpose of this step is to introduce the topic of the listening text, set the scene, and engage and motivate the students. The second step in this lesson pattern has students listen once to the text for the general situation or the main idea. So students are establishing the scenario, the characters, the relationships among the characters, the emotional tone of the text, or the main argument of the text. The third step of this pattern has students listen a second time, and this time they're listening for content detail. So they're answering or listening for specific details to deepen their understanding of the topic or the situation. The final step in this lesson pattern is free practice, and this is a productive step. Steps 2 and 3 were receptive steps, so students were using the receptive skill of listening. In this final step, they're switching over to the productive skills, either speaking or writing. And you're giving the students the opportunity to work with the topic and the ideas presented in the listening text. Your target here is a focus on meaning and a focus on fluency. You'll see that each of the steps in this shorter lesson pattern all focus on meaning. So we have 2 steps at which students are listening for meaning. First, general meaning, and then detailed meaning. And then the final step has students processing or working with this meaning to somehow produce language, either through speaking or writing. So this heavy focus on meaning is why we obviously call this the meaning lesson pattern. Here's a sample meaning lesson pattern. This is for an intermediate group of students. The objective of this lesson pattern is students will be able to talk about different cultural practices. For the warm-up, ask students in which country the following cultural practices are common. Bowing when meeting someone, men holding hands, and using only the right hand to eat. Then ask students if they have experienced any of these cultural practices firsthand. Finally, ask students which of these cultural practices would be most difficult for them to get used to given their own cultural background. For the next step, you're going to have students listen for the general situation or main idea. Tell students that they're going to hear a monologue or a single speaker about a trip to the Sudan. Ask them to speculate about what cultural practices they might hear about in this monologue. Then have them listen to the monologue to confirm their predictions about those cultural practices and confirm the answers as a class. For the third step, have students listen to specific detail about these cultural practices. So have them listen and write down everything they hear about what you do and don't do in this particular cultural situation. The final step is the free practice, and we're going to do a speaking activity here. As a class, ask students for times when they have made a mistake with a cultural practice. Then have students work individually to prepare some advice for visitors to their country with regards to specific cultural practices. What should visitors be careful not to do in that particular cultural context? Once students have noted down some ideas, put them in groups of mixed cultures and then have them share their ideas. So that was an example of exploiting a listening text for meaning. Each one of those steps focused on meaning. So we were listening for general meaning, for specific meaning, and then students were producing their own meaning on the same topic. Now let's take a look at the final lesson pattern. The final lesson pattern that we'll look at for fully exploiting a listening text focuses on exploiting that text for the form or the language that is used. Here's what this lesson pattern looks like step by step. This lesson pattern starts the same way as the other two patterns did, with a warm-up. However, the purpose of the warm-up in this case is to introduce the language of the listening text, and at the same time you want to engage and motivate the students. In step 2 of this lesson pattern, students are listening for language. So you're directing them to listen for a particular piece of pronunciation, particular vocabulary words, particular grammatical structures, or discourse structures. This is the only time in this lesson pattern that students listen to the text, and the focus here is on form. The third step in the lesson pattern is to have students analyze the language. So we're switching to the productive side of things here, but we're still focusing on form. So we're going to analyze the rules, patterns, format, or meanings of whatever particular pieces of language you had students listen for in step 2. In step 3, students are completing a controlled practice activity. So you want to give them the opportunity to use the language they learned from the listening text in a controlled manner. You want students to be accurate, and you're going to give them quite detailed feedback. You're once again focusing on form, but this is another productive step. And the final step in this lesson pattern is free practice. So the purpose of this step is to give students the opportunity to use the language they've learned from the listening text fluently and freely in a real situation. Your focus is on fluency, and this is another productive step. These are the steps in the form lesson pattern, and you'll notice every single one of those steps focused on form or language. Let's take a look at a sample lesson plan for this particular lesson pattern. This lesson plan is for an intermediate class. The objectives are students will be able to listen for and produce past forms when storytelling. For the warm-up, tell students that they're going to listen to a story about someone who went to the Sudan and experienced some interesting cultural challenges. Elicit from students the verb forms that they would expect to hear when they're listening to a story. So you want to elicit the different past verb forms. For the second step, students are listening for the language. Before you play the listening text, create a table on the board with the following headings: past simple, past continuous, other past forms. Play the text and have students listen and take notes on the verb tenses or verb forms that they hear using the table you've created. Then confirm the answers as a class, and if you want, have them look at the actual transcript to check their answers. In the third step, students are going to analyze the language they heard. So the second step was your only receptive step. Now we're moving on to the productive steps, but we're still focusing just on language. So students look at each of the verb tenses in the chart in turn and confirm the form, so how it is made, and also the rules for when this particular verb tense or verb form is used. For the fourth step, the controlled practice, have participants write 10 sentences about cultural practice mistakes they have made in the past. Tell them to use the forms that were presented in the listening text. As the final step, students are going to do a free practice. Ask students for times when they have made a cultural mistake. Have students get into pairs and tell their partner one of these stories about their experiences. This was an example of a form lesson pattern. Every single one of the steps in this lesson pattern focused on the form or the language that was presented in the listening text. Students listened only one time, and they were listening for language, and then they switched into productive activities where they were first analyzing the language using it in a controlled way, and finally using it in a freer, less controlled way. These three lesson patterns allow us to strategically choose how we're going to use listening texts when we're teaching our listening lessons. The first lesson pattern, the hourglass lesson pattern, allows us to exploit the text for meaning and form. The second lesson pattern, the meaning lesson pattern, very obviously lets us exploit the text for meaning. And finally, the form lesson pattern allows us to exploit the listening text for form. Remember from the beginning of this video that when we're teaching listening, we want to fully exploit our listening text. These three lesson patterns allow us to do that. We can exploit the text for meaning and form, just meaning, or just form. By making these decisions strategically, you can best meet your student learning needs with the listening text you choose and the lesson patterns with which you teach those listening texts.